Okay, so today I'm going to go over, actually it's the first device that I ever created. It's called AP3632, and it's basically a simple interface for you to be able to use random modulators attached to parameters inside of MRhythmizer. So today I'm just going to give you a couple of use cases where I find myself using this a lot. I'm sure people will be using it in all types of other ways, but I'm just going to show you kind of how I use it. All right, so the very first thing is I have a chord progression, but I want to add some spice to it. And it's a really simple chord progression. Let me play it back for you. Okay, so you get the idea. And that's cool, but I kind of want to add some extra rhythm to the pattern. Let's say one of those like kind of filter patterns that you would hear in Future Bass a lot. So the easiest way to do this is add AP3632, in my case the keys track, which is here. And since I know I want to use a filter pattern, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here, and where you see filter, I'm going to click it so that it's highlighted. And now when I play back the pattern, you'll be able to hear the filter pattern changing. You can also see down here, this filter pattern identifier is moving as well. So let me play it back for you. So the first thing I noticed is that the speed of the pattern for me is fairly slow. So you can change the speed that the patterns are played back at by changing the speed here. So if I raise this, sometimes I like it slower, sometimes I like it faster. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click this speed button here. And what it's basically going to do is it's just going to randomly select speed options. So as we go through, sometimes they'll be on a fourth, sometimes they'll be on one, sometimes they'll be on four. It just depends on the beat. So right now the filter pattern's being randomized and the speed's being randomized. So let's play this back. So you may have noticed that it's only rotating between 1/4, a half, and 1x. And the reason for this is because of the default parameters for the oscillator that's controlling the speed is set to a maximum of 1x. So if you wanted to change that, what you would do is come over to the speed tab, and as you can see here, the maximum is 1. So if I was to raise this to 4, when we come back here, you'll see it now moves between a fourth all the way up to 4. Depending on your tempo, some of these might be too fast or too slow. And so you can come over here for any of the random modulators and change the minimum and the maximum. So for this, I'm going to go with 2x for a maximum because I think 4 is a little bit too fast. So this is cool and all, but the patterns are always playing. So it's a little bit aggressive to me. There's not enough time for you to feel the chord progression and then kind of get a little bit of spice, maybe at the end or the beginning or in the middle. It's just always running a filter pattern, which, depending on what you're trying to do, it might be perfect, it might not. But if it is too much, that's where this mix tab comes into play. So if you come over to this mix tab, you can enable it. And you basically have a step sequencer here where you can pick what steps are affected. So if it says dry, there will be 0 possibility of a filter pattern playing back. If you move it up to wet on certain steps, it'll randomize that step with the pattern. And one thing you can see, there's a step indicator here so that you can see where you are in time. Because I know when these step sequencers get really long, you have to listen back to the whole thing to figure out where you are. So this step indicator is just to help you with that. And these two actually sync up. So if I press play, you'll see now they're in sync. so you can be on any tab and have an idea of where you are in terms of the mix sequencer. So what I want to do is I want to change the length of this because I want it to match up basically with my chord progression. So let's move this loop to here. So at 17, it's going back to the beginning. So I want it to go back to the beginning when it hits 32 so that I can use all of these steps. So I'm going to change the length to half. And now when I play this back, the chord progression should start on 1 and end on 32. Perfect. So now I can choose which parts of this are dry and which parts are wet. A lot of the times I find myself doing like these first 4 steps maybe, and then something at the end. So maybe the last 8 steps. One thing to keep in mind also is if these steps are all the way at the top, it'll actually mute the step, and you can see that written here. So I'm just going to make sure I put them somewhere in the middle, and then I'm going to play this back. Let's see what we have. Okay, cool. So that's way more in control. It only randomizes the filter pattern on the first step or on the first 4 beats and the last 8 beats. And that way you can kind of, just add a little bit of spice. But you can definitely, if you want to put way more steps in here, make the pattern length longer, shorter, whatever works for you. I've basically given you all the settings that relate to the modulator that control this. So yeah, just do whatever works for you. In the same way that this works with the filtered pattern, where this is randomized, it also works with the volume and it also works with the time. So if you turn on the time, you'll see time is moving now. If I turn on volume, volume is moving now. But for this one, I just want to use the filter because it's a pad. I'll show you another use case where I'm going to use the time one in a second. One last thing you may or may not notice is right now this mix sequencer is on sequencer mode. If you change this to auto, it'll actually randomize dry, wet, and mute for you. So if you just want to go crazy and let it decide which steps to enable and which steps not to, you can use this auto button instead of the sequencer button. So that's going to be it for the keys. I want to show you how I would use AP3632 on a drum pattern. So let's just listen back to the drum pattern really quick. Okay, so the drum pattern's cool and I really like it, but once again I want to add some extra variation to it. So I'm going to add another AP3632. Instead of using the filter pattern, I'm going to use the time pattern. I'm going to enable time, and as you'll see here, it starts to move by itself, and whenever you enable it, it becomes ungrayed out here. So if you see one that's grayed out, it's because you need to enable it. So let's start with this. I'm just going to enable time and let's see kind of how the pattern changes. So it's more apparent the randomization happening all the time it's too much. You completely lose the bass rhythm of the pattern. So instead of having it play through the entire pattern, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to allow it to play, but I'm going to come over here to the mix sequencer, enable it, and let's see how long our pattern length is, because I want to match up the first beat to the first part of the pattern, and I want to match up the last beat to the last beat in the pattern. So let's press play. And that works for me. Technically, the pattern played twice, but the section in this song is actually going to be that long. So even though the pattern plays twice, I'm just going to leave it there. And I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to say I want it to be wet on the first two steps, let's say, and then 13, 14, 15, and 16, 17, and 18, and then let's do the last 8 on this side, and let's see how this sounds. Might be a little too much still, but let's play it back. Might be too much. Let's try taking off the first 2 beats of each section so we just kind of get a fill. But I still want to add a little bit more. So if you remember from the last one, the speed allows the pattern playback speed to be faster. So I'm going to turn this on again. And let's see how this affects the pattern. Okay, I like that much better. So you have some variation in playback of the patterns, and it just makes it a little bit more dynamic. The last thing I'm going to add is tempo. And tempo is interesting. It doesn't change the speed of the playback, but it changes where within a pattern the playback starts. So either it'll be in sync with your host, or it'll be in sync with when the triggering happens. It's basically this knob here. And so one side is sync with host, the other side is tempo sync. They're both exactly the same, but one will re-trigger a pattern from the beginning, while the other one will always be in step with the host, but they both play back in sync. I hope I explained that well enough, but it does add a lot of variation to the track. So let me turn that on so that you can get an idea of how this affects the pattern. And as a matter of fact, I will open up randomizer so that you can see when host sync is enabled, this is always going to continue to move forward. So let's turn this off. Let's turn off tempo. If you see, this line is always moving forward. Sometimes the speed option changes how fast it plays back, but it's in sync with where you are in the host. Whereas when you turn on tempo, every time a new pattern is triggered, it starts from beat 1. So if you kind of hop back in between the two, you get some really cool variations in terms of pattern and timing and all of that type of stuff. So let's play this back so that you can kind of hear what that does. Okay, cool. So if I put the drum pattern and the keys together, instead of what we had before, we now have a ton of variation, and it makes something that was a fairly simple song or track way more interesting. So let's play this back. The one thing I do want to mention that I didn't really talk about is the actual modulator settings. So this time lapse is giving you an approximation of how often this time pattern is going to change. So you can speed that up by using higher values. You see it's moving faster. So if we go back here, speed's moving really fast. If I drop this down to something like half, it now takes a lot longer to switch in between each. And you can do that for each and every one. So if I come over here to time and I speed this up, you can see it's kind of giving you an indication of how fast it's switching. And if we come over here, you can see it's moving really fast as well. Then I can change it to something that's really slow, like 2. And it'll move quite a bit slower. So that just gives you a little bit of extra control over how the modulator is affecting the transition between each pattern. So on speed, the smoothness knob, if you drop this all the way down to 0, you'll notice that it only moves in between the lowest and the highest value that you set in minimum and maximum. If you set it to something like 3%, so let's set it to 3, and let's set this maximum to 4, you'll notice that it only moves in between the top value, the lowest value, and the center value. And I'm not exactly sure why that behavior is that way, but that's just something to keep in mind. So if you're noticing some weird behavior, the default for all of these is smoothness to 100. The only one where smoothness is not at 100 is on tempo, because on tempo, I only want it to affect the top and the lowest value, because anything in between these two breaks sync with the track. So if you do want it to occasionally break sync, you can turn up the smoothness, and you can see this tempo knob will actually pick in between a bunch of random tempos. And sometimes that's really interesting, actually. So that's basically it for AP3632. It's basically kind of like the ultimate random M-rhythmizer face GUI. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it. Head over to KVR. There'll be another forum post. Let me know if there's anything that you want me to change. Yeah, that's it. Have a good one. Peace.